Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. My name is Savannah Madamombe, and today I bring you back Professor Laurent Perrault. And we had a conversation here last week, and we talked about everything, her journey, her life, where she had been. But we didn't even get a chance to speak about what she does, what she is educated for, why she is even called a professor. Now, let me bring you back, Evelyn. So, today we want to talk about Evelyn and her profession and what it means to all of us as a people. Welcome, Evelyn.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing me again. I hope the people are still enjoying to have a person
Of
twice in.
course, of course. But, before we even go back to talking about what we were talking about last week, something just happened today, something I feel we need to get into.
Yeah.
And I think you are the right person for me to discuss what just happened today.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Biden has been nominated has been confirmed as the next president of the United States. What does that mean for us as a people?
Yes. Yes. The Democratic Party, Joe Biden, and more significantly, Kamala Harris, the first
Yes.
woman of African descent to become the vice president of this nation. A sharp woman, sharp. She stands on the shoulder of people from Africa via Jamaica, people from India via Jamaica at the same time.
How rich is that? How rich is that?
It is an amazing opportunity, and we all need to use that and galvanize that process to address and speak up,
Yes.
because we are moving from a moment of a lot of division and hate. I'm still in
Mhm.
shock from what I keep hearing about Democrats hating. I never hated anybody. I didn't like it. I disagree strongly. And I felt flabbergasted by the excessive use of power and the division. But I didn't hate anybody. I don't know anybody who's Democrat who hated anybody. But
Yes.
that's the kind of discourse and there's a kind of language that has been positioned in these past 4 years, which have
Mhm.
affected even more this country and the world, because the world is affected, but you might actually exacerbate that by what you say. And in these last 4 years, sadly, have had a lot of hate rhetoric into
Yes.
the politics, which is very, very dangerous because then
Yes.
cultivate fanatism, and fanatism prevents people from having a conversation. We can
Yes.
disagree, but we should always be able to have a conversation. And I'm
Yeah.
the one who believes that everybody should have access to the position of leadership, because if it sits in only one hand, no matter
Yes.
how good the intentions are, power is going to eat that person and that party and that community alive. And
Yeah.
so I think this is very significant. We have someone with a lot of experience, Biden. We have Kamala, although she's young in the government, she has a lot of stamina. She brings a lot of knowledge. She's a senator from California, which is the most successful state in this nation from the economic point of view.
Yes.
At the same time, she brings her own self. She brings her history. She brings who she is. And so it's an opportunity to have a lot of conversations about inclusion, about equality, about access of opportunities. And so I think this is a very interesting moment, given also the pandemic and everything else that's going on. So I think, I mean, whew.
Yeah. But
I
most significantly, why I wanna us to zoom a little bit more on Camara is because of your your PhD, right?
yeah,
It is based on
African diaspora.
African diaspora. Not only are you focused on African diaspora, you also focused on women.
Yes, yes, yes.
Can we talk about that?
Yes, yes, yes. And so Um, in the whole misconception of history,
Yes.
most of national histories have revolved around big men, usually from the elite, heroes in
Yes.
battles who have been killing and murdering and waging wars and winning and waging revolutions and so on. And I became interested in researching what enslaved and free Black women did in the colonial period. I was interested in understanding what was their position and also
Yes.
how the process of racialization had established dynamic of racist dynamic in Venezuela and Latin America. So these were my two main interests. I'm a woman. I wanted to know what Black women have done in the past and how that has impacted how we perceive one another. And to my amazing and beautiful surprise, I'm finding it even more. But in particular, in Spanish America, the whole corpus of the law did allow for people who were enslaved to go to court. It doesn't mean that they had full standing judicial persona. In fact, they did not. They could only go to court if they were going to place a lawsuit against their owners. Otherwise, the owners were the one who speak on behalf of the enslaved person. Now, in the urban centers, not in the plantation rural areas, but in all the urban centers in Spanish America and also in Brazil, but I don't know much about Brazil. I know more about Lima, Mexico, Cartagena. Women were a majority. Why? Because there were the higher need for washerwomen, for cook, for seamstress, for midwives, because the cities, the urban centers had the higher number of population, period. And so the number of enslaved women in the urban centers were quite high. That doesn't mean that they were 3 times or 4 times more than men. It just was high. As compared to the perception on plantation, women were also very ubiquitous in plantations as well. And they cultivated and cut cane and grew cocoa and tobacco as well as men. Now, what I discover in my own process of the PhD and my own is that more women end up going before judicial authorities. This happened in Lima, this happened in Santiago de Chile, this happened in Buenos Aires, this happened in Cartagena, this happened in Mexico City, this happened even in the United States, in places, in situations in which, in theory, people didn't have access to law. People always did search for that. Now, there has been a tendency to say that people did imitate or use the European judicial system. There is a historian called Roquinaldo Ferreira. He's Brazilian. He has documented judicial systems in Kikongo and Kimbundu existing in Angola. As the slave trade was expanding, people would go to those African-based judicial structure to advocate for themselves. So the tradition of going before authorities to negotiate one's condition of people from Africa did not start in the Americas. That comes from political organized structure and societies that were already in place in Africa before this whole trauma began. And so, in the case of Caracas in particular, between 1789 and 1810, there were more than 1,000 petitions before the authorities, which is the place that I focus my research. About 52% of those who petitioned were women. Now, women would, when they went, they either were trying to negotiate freedom, purchase their freedom because they had worked and saved money and they were able to one, or they found someone who would lend them their money. Either way. And usually when people went before the authorities is because they had tried many other ways without the success that they wanted. And so when you read and pay careful attention of what these women were trying to assess and look for, you see that many of them had, prior to that intervention, began to negotiate some levels of autonomy, some quantum of freedom, some little aspects of dignity, because enslavement was not only making people produce, it was about the assumption that a person could own another person. So the idea,
Yes.
and
Yes.
not and even though the is being constructed as turning the enslaved person into a chattel, the owner needed the humanity of the enslaved. One, to trust that person who was going to cook, feed you, and take care of you, and the other one to display power. Because I don't gain any power by having power over a donkey, because the donkey is
No.
a donkey.
No.
But
No.
but if as a person I want to prove power because power is so important for me, then having and claiming and showing off that I own other human beings, then exacerbate this illness, this pathology called power. And so these enslaved women, and many also who were free but were married to enslaved people or had enslaved children because they were able to obtain their freedom after they were moms, would also go to court to negotiate for the loved ones. And so, for instance, there is a case of a woman. Her name was Pascuala. In 1730, she began negotiating with her mistress, her friend.
Yes.
But she had started negotiating way before because she had already agreed with her mistress that she could work for wages, that she could keep some of that money, and not only that, she was able to live by herself, feed herself, and clothe herself. Clothing was very important because clothing would denote in public who had rights to be respected or not. And so the laws prohibited Black women, Black, mulattas, and mixed women of African descent to wear pearls, gold, jewelry, and fine clothing. And women actually precisely tried to buy those. And so this woman actually talks about how she had become, she doesn't use the word autonomous or
Yes.
independent, but she
Yes.
says that she had been able, with her mistress, to negotiate and take care of this item. So this thing that she was able to take care of were part of creating a space, an autonomous space. And the fact that, and she says that in the court case, that she was able to take care of her needs for a long
Yes.
time. So that to me speak of not only autonomy, but reclaiming a sense of self, a sense of dignity that
Yes.
enslavement precisely needed to pretend to take away, to turn the person into a subordinate individual, which is,
Yes.
and so you see that some women went to court and negotiated, it was fine. But there are some cases that were longer because the
Yes.
owners refused to. And they
Yes.
had to negotiate and bring witness and talk about that. So these women, many of them didn't know how to read and write, but they were thinking, imagining themselves in a different situation, and they were positioning their ideas in the platform of the justice system.
Yes.
Now, we tend to think of the enlightenment or knowledge or ideas such as rights, freedom, liberty as coming from those who wrote them in Europe.
Yes.
I argue that these women and these men who were deprived of freedom, who were
They are the ones.
they were the one who were, I mean, thinking, imagining. The idea of equality didn't exist in monarchies because monarchies stand in the whole thing of the king above and everybody below. And
Yes.
so, and you, if you trace, none of them use the word equality. None of them use those words, but they are dreaming with something larger than them at that particular moment. Now, the authorities may or may have not been in the capacity to recognize these women as political agents. That doesn't mean
Yeah.
that they're not. And because of sexism, misogynism, and patriarchy, their role in history has not fully been acknowledged because it's very difficult to make the direct connection between what they said and what the other ones wrote. But for instance, I found fascinating that Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, in his 1785 piece, he elaborates precisely on rights, on
Yes.
autonomy, and on freedom. Now, he wasn't in a capsule in Europe because Europe had every single European nation power empire had connection with a corner in the Caribbean or in the Americas, and then later on in Africa. So it's not that he thought of that himself. He must have known, heard, read reports by people, the authorities in the Americas, sending that to Europe, and read this and realized, oh, rights, oh, freedom, oh, liberty, oh,
Yes.
autonomy, oh, equality, for him to beautifully elaborate. I'm not taking it away from him. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that it didn't come entirely from him. It was something that was negotiated. And then women, because more women use the core system, women were at the center of that process. And to this day, in at least in Spanish America, Black women are perceived as the one who nurse, the wet nursing only. And the
Yes.
nursing is just reducing African women and their daughters to their breast, not to their mind. And also, women gave birth to more enslaved people. And so, women, so until now, are seen by the womb that gave enslaved people, the vagina that gave pleasure to their owners, and the breast that nursed the kids of the masters. And I'm like, no, 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 no. That, I mean, we need to acknowledge that suffering because that was.
We are more than breast and vagina, for crying out loud.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We are much more than breast and vagina. We have a head, and that head was thinking and dreaming the changes of political ideologies that was going to be embraced by the so-called Enlightenment. So that's what my work is focused. So I trace, I've read several hundred cases of women who negotiated, and several authors have actually looked at how women, for instance, all the laws of free womb came because of mothers negotiating, because it was a concern. No mother wanted to have an enslaved child. No African men wanted to have slave children. We see how in many places African men understood that it was better to have their children with an indigenous woman because those children would be free. And then that was a way to cut the cycle of enslavement. So
You
it is.
know, you let me hold you right there because you hit where my next question was going to go to. I wanted to find out, what do you think and how do you think this all affected us as women?
Oh, yeah.
How it affected our men, how it affected our family and relations, and how we communicate through this experience.
It hurt. It hurt very much because the other thing to understand also is that we now dysfunction in patriarchal settings, which are really exacerbated. And I'm not saying that patriarchy come only from one corner, but the
Mhm.
process of enslavement was nurtured by an exacerbated, excessive enactment of patriarchy. Prior to the connection, the prior to the expansion or explosion of the trade between Europe and Africa, you find almost of the African societies, women could be rulers and leaders. And in societies where the women were not the rulers, they were the one who chose the ruler. So the position of women engaging in trade, women engage in travels. This thing of the domestication of women inside a household, this is something that many African society did not have. Okay? And so this whole process of commodifying, buying and selling and reselling people, buying and reselling children of mothers and fathers, the constant raping of Black African women and of men too, men were raped as well, did impact significantly how people were going to love one another, because then African love was turning to only exclusively sex. And I have nothing against sex. But and because sex can be a way to connect with people in many different ways. The committed love is just one of them. But the way it was abused by the whole process of enslavement, it took away so much from what it should be. So and I say that because I'm not the kind of moral person who think that it should happen only within promise, marriage, and all that. No, people should have the freedom to decide how, when it's going to happen. But with the construct of marriage, strict monogamy, church, and then women from African and African descent constructed as bad women, amoral, lustful, completely destroy the perception even about ourselves. I often question, and this is something that I don't work on that, but I would love to talk with psychologists about that. What did it do for people who descended from African women to hear constantly that their mother were not moral, were not decent, were not respectable, were not intelligent, in a choice that boys were going to make for those who like women when they had to choose women? How can Black boys today even choose Black women disconnected from all the baggage that has been created? How do Black people who are gay and lesbian are going to choose also Black partners, given all the negative stereotyping that we have all been loaded with about the negativity that is being constructed around Blackness? So, and how are we going to love, worship, and respect those partners, those children, and their relatives and our friends? So it really complicates the matter. Let's even forget about how those who are not perceived as Black or African are going to relate with one another, with other ethnicities, read as whatever is called other whatever races, which is we only have one race, human, but we dysfunction seeing each
Yes.
other in those particular ways. We are dealing with wounds. I went to a talk, I don't remember her name, but I need to pull it out. A woman from Martinique who, she actually is from Haiti, but she works in Martinique, and she gave a talk about how complicated it is to love within African Black circles, because we have so many, we carry so many wounds, that is difficult to love when you're so wounded, and it's generational. It's like you add several generations, and those wounds are lived in the diaspora and the continent, because Europe, then when the slavery ended, Europe decided to carry slavery to the continent, and that's what is known as colonialism. And
Yeah,
so,
because you bring colonialism. My next question was going to ask, colonialism comes into Africa, right? It brings in Christianity and they bring in Western culture. Now, how does this affect a people of African descent who have their own culture and their own religion?
well, I think the continent is still trying to overcome this. But for me, one of the main sequels of this colonial presence that it began at the end of the 19th century, and it dragged until the 60s, 70s, 80s. So basically, in a sense, and in many ways, it continues. I mean, it's not over. I mean, Europe still
Yes.
has grip on most of Africa. It's a terrible additional level of wounds, because then one of the things was to try to tell Africans over and over that they were savage, that the religions were savage, that the music was backward, that the culture was useless, that
It's
the
evil,
is evil. Yes,
demonic.
it was diabolic, it was devilish, and that it had to be uprooted, and anything connected with it was evil. And so what does that does, especially because then kids were supposed to go to missionary schools. And so whatever the grandparents were going to teach them, the little kid then is empowered to question and dismiss the line of knowledge that had come from generation to generation, and then to pretend to impose something else. So it was excessively sophisticated in its way to try to cut African self-reliance and pride and sense of self. If
Yeah.
you lose your sense of self, people can tell you you're a dog and you begin barking. I mean,
Yes.
but if you know who you are because you know where you came from, you might be critical within your own about what is yours. And everybody has the right to do that because cultures are constantly changing. But it has to come from within. When some people come from outside and begin bombard you with nonsense and prohibit you to play your instrument, to dance your song, to go through your rite of passages, to change the way you eat, the way you dress, the way you celebrate, man, that's the beginning of a really bad situation. And so, and especially one thing is to make people believe that Africa did not have political systems. And so that's for me, when I was in Africa, I was blown to learn about how in some societies the ruler could not be corrupt because he could be tried and executed. So if you know as a ruler that if you messed up and they cut you, I mean, it might, doesn't mean that I support the death penalty because I don't, but there were some structures in place. And so you have to tell
Yeah.
me that it was not because what is saw is that no, these people were savages who didn't have anything. They didn't know who they were, didn't have a religion, didn't have a political society. And then of course I began to that's why I began to do more research. And in my training in the PhD, I had to take several courses about Africa. And every time I can, I read more, and then you understand, wait a second, this is a big lie. But it had, though this lie had to be constructed in order to mount this apparatus, this machine, this people eating machine, this African people eating machine. And so it takes it, and then of course, and sadly, quite often, many of those who end up holding power achieve this power because they are reproducing this so-called West. There is no Western. I mean, Europe is not Europe without all the connection and learning they did from the Amerindians and Africans, okay? But
Hmm.
they have constructed themselves as the pure good West, and everything else is the bad or backward or savage something. And so those lies, they had to implement them in order to dominate. If I come to your house and I want to take your house, and I don't want, I mean, of course, I may try by force, but if I want to keep it for myself, I have to convince you that you don't even
Yeah.
know how to do your program. I mean, I have to convince you that I'm the one who created your program, and I'm the
Yeah.
one who actually knows more than you and your team about putting together, and which is what happened. And so, but as it sounds crazy, but that is what is colonialism. I come to you, you invite me, and I come to you and I say, I'm going to destroy Savannah thing, and I'm going to take over her and her team, and I'm going to convince her they know nothing. I'm the one who knows when I'm the one being interviewed. And I'm going to do it in so many ways that at the end, I'm going to break you so much because it's not going to be just me and my
Yeah.
apparatus. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, so
So
that's
do you really, in a sense, think that we as a people are suffering from a major trauma caused by colonialism? And if this is so, how do you think it affects us? And what are some of the symptoms that you see that we can say this one is suffering from the trauma of colonialism?
well, there is. Ah, listen, when someone like Paul Biya has been in power for like how long? I lost count.
Yeah.
And so, and people who are in leadership are so in love with power. That's one. Power is sweet, but there were mechanisms to make sure that people rotate off.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
of them have been lost. And so that's one. The process of I don't like the word development because it is a word loaded with a lot of baggage. But if we think
Yes.
about the way group society decides to organize and reorganize themselves towards the common good of everybody, has been interrupted in Africa, and Africa needs to reconnect, which is a challenge because a lot of the things have been stolen, a lot of the structure has been affected, and there is a very big dichotomy between the rural and the urban, like everywhere else. I mean, there is a big gap between urban and rural, and there's a process of healing that needs to happen. I mean, people needs to heal, and heal can take place in many different ways, and it will have to take place in different ways in different places. What works for South Africa, for example, may not work for Cameroon, or work for Central African Republic, may not work for Zimbabwe. um, there's an issue also of access to land ownership. I
You
learned.
know, hold on a second. We really want to go to that because there's a lot, especially I come from Zimbabwe and land is an issue. But
Yeah.
before we do that, I want us to take a quick break and hear a message from our sponsors and then come back to that very conversation. Welcome back. And we were talking about something that caught me, land. And the reason why I want us to kind of really spend some time and focus on that is because if you look at our African culture, it centers on land.
Land. Yeah.
But as it centers on land, the concept that is here in the US or many of other European countries, which has an individual ownership, which means land belongs to me. And if I get it, it's for me and my children and generations to come, was not the same concept that we had.
Exactly. The concept of that somebody can own land, that I believe is very European, because indigenous
Yes.
people in the Americas, Africans, and I believe also Asian societies did not espouse this idea of owning land, because land is where you're going to cultivate food. So
Yes.
you cannot prevent people from growing food. Sadly, that has been the number one issue throughout the places
Yes.
that Europe went, because
And
Europe,
this is why people are killing each other because of land.
land
Yes,
and water.
we can all utilize it as needed and let it go.
And not only that, because one thing is Europe had the idea that every piece of land has to be used according to what they wanted to grow for trade and export. And without understanding that land is, first of all, not only because it's a place where you grow your food, it's sacred. So
Yes.
in most of these cultures, indigenous and land is actually a site where divinity also gives you fruits, give you your harvest, and gives and that's where the wildlife, the wild you're going to hunt also is. And of course, you cannot have animals to hunt if you don't have plants. So, and if you
Yes.
don't have access to land. And so that's one. When
Yes.
Europeans arrived in most places, because most places have different quality of land, and
Yes.
they decided that they were going to take for themselves the best land. And once and then give and then leave the least productive lands to majorities. And so that in on itself not only is an abuse and but is also a theft of access to sacred spaces.
Yeah.
And
And
therefore, and in most societies had, and that's the other thing also, understanding how people revere and worship. I know, for instance, in the Andes, the Incas used to have symbols that represented things, that represented deities. The sun is not that people were worshiping the sun. The sun is the major body that gives energy. If the universe and the Almighty, whichever you want to think about the Almighty, is the source of life, the source of energy, and you want to think of what is the element that produces the highest amount of energy in this galaxy, what is the sun? Then you're going to say, well, I'm going to salute the sun because without the sun, I cannot grow anything. If the sun explodes, that's it. We only have like few days left because that's it. I mean, it will be it. So if I want to choose to represent or to think of the sun as the iconography of the major source of energy, then I'm
yes,
going to worship. But it doesn't mean that I'm worshiping the physical entity.
the
So,
physical. Yeah.
exactly. So the same thing. If nature is giving me food, I'm going to thank nature and I'm going to have rituals to thank nature. So the European societies, by the time they began expanding, had lost that appreciation and that understanding.
Yeah.
And so it had to be this God with it has to be look like people, it has to have the has to be this white guy with the white son, the white mom, and the blue eyes and the blonde hair and so on.
An image of themselves as the God.
Yeah. And that is a humongous mess that had caused a lot of horror, in spite of the fact that it might also carry some truth in it.
Yeah.
But the whole, so that, and then if you go back to the point of the land, in Zimbabwe, I know that the land was classified, I think, in like 3 or 4 different types. And the British colonial kept the best of the best to grow from
Evelyn, I can give you a personal story right there.
ah, ah,
Okay.
ah.
I normally want to listen to you, but I think it's important that I express this on a very personal level. And I've said this before. My father, when he was 6, he remembers walking for days because they had been removed from a place where they called home, and they walked for days with nothing. They left their cattle because they were told you can't move with your cattle, because the land that they had been given to what they called commercial farmers, because it was good land. So they gave it to what they called commercial farmers. And there were no black commercial farmers. They were all white commercial farmers. So their land was taken, including any livestock. They were not allowed to live with any, not even a chicken, because they were told if you move these cattle from here to the way you're going to carry diseases. That's the reason what they used to rob my grandfather. So they moved with nothing to
That's it.
to a different area where they were given a smaller place to live, and it's nothing but sand, gullies. They can't really even farm or do anything, and they had to start all over again. They have not been compensated. We have not been compensated. My father, to the day he died, was trying to get our land back, to no avail. And I feel that burden on me.
Well, that's number one. That's theft. That's that. But
But
that's
who is redressing that for
but
all the
that's
black
a
people?
cascade of theft. I mean, Africans were taken, stolen from the continent, and when they could no longer do that, so they came to the land to steal land to set up their economic enterprise. Not only your father was kicked out, but then he was forced to buy, to work for somebody to get the money to buy the food and the meat and the chicken and the eggs that he had been able to produce before. So that whole chain of self-sufficiency was
Was
smashed.
destroyed. Is there a wonder why Africa is in poverty the way it is? Do we
Yeah, yeah. I
we have
know.
been impoverished from back then to now?
Yeah,
Our
yeah, yeah.
resources and everything.
And so, and that surrender, that's what I said. The way, the path that Africa could have taken on its own was smashed by this. It began to be smashed when 20 million people at the reproductive age were kidnapped out. So 20 million people is the amount of people that occupy one nation, one small, medium-sized nation. So that in on itself is already a major issue. Then the whole way of trade got altered because then people who wanted to hold power became greed. And so global market economy began to happen. Now, during the slave trade, there were people who were trading using cowrie shell, and they thought that they had become rich. When colonialism happened and the Europeans came, Europeans said, "No, that's no longer money. We have our money. What you had is trash." So even those who thought they were tricked into fall into the idea of enriching themselves automatically became poor when colonialism came. And then people like your father,
Yeah,
and when you say your father, this is your one generation. But how long
yeah,
have
but
you
that's my
been
father
in the
is
family?
6, and my grandfather, whose land was being stolen, his father, who is my great grandfather, had been killed for trying to rebel. They they roasted him on a bonfire. So it's generations of pillaging and killing. And how do I then reclaim all that glory? What does my grandfather give me or my great grandfather give me? Nothing, because it was taken.
And not only that, then this also speak of a humongous, enormous amount of violence. So to recover for violence requires a
Violence.
humongous process because it requires healing. And healing, but healing has few aspects. There is healing, and there is how does one recover that sense of self going back? How then, because this, I know in Zimbabwe this happened a lot, how Zimbabweans can retrace back their stage of self-sufficiency and rebuild based upon that ancient knowledge, the music, the sculpture, the storytelling, the dancing, the spirituality.
I
It,
was gonna ask you that.
yeah, no, that's tough because then religion has missionaries brought these new forms of religion. And
Yeah.
there are religions that incorporate other elements, but there are some religions that ban because of the fear of the devil.
Yes, yes,
Therefore,
yes.
so it requires a lot of work. A
Yeah, because I
lot.
was going to ask you, how can we as African descendants and people on the continent themselves become truly the masters of our own destination? Because we can complain all we want, we can continue. I know there's trauma from where we are coming from, but how can we master our destination moving forward?
One thing, I might be biased, but for me, for my own journey of reclaiming my blackness and being in love with it and feel proud of it and so on, has been learning my history. learning history. Not letting others to tell me what they want me to believe, but to dig out and reclaim my history and teaching my daughters the history and
Yes, in
telling
your own
them,
words.
yes, and telling them this is who you are, this is where you come from, this is the several lines of people, this is all the horrors that have happened, but this is you. You come from a line that you might be told XYZ. That's not true. And so, number one is to understand the history. Number two is to become acquaintance with those traditions, cultures. They might be things that you don't like in them. That's fine. But you need to know. You need to know
Yeah,
because, for instance, the idea that Africans only had or didn't have music. Oh yeah, just the drums. You have to understand what percussion is. You need to understand what mbira is. You need to understand what kora. The
yeah,
first time I heard kora, I was a grown up. I was in Africa, and I
yeah,
was like, how come I never heard this instrument before? Music made by this instrument. How come I never heard music made by mbira before? How come? Because there is a complot of preventing to prevent us to know who we are. If we know who we are going back, then we will like, no, no, this
it's not
land,
us.
yeah, and not only that, this land was taken. This is belong to me, and the whole mumble jumble of Western justice then will fall through because
Yeah,
then, I mean, somebody came and stole it. As simple as that. Then you basically have to judge the one who stole them and they're no longer around. But you can say, well, this was done on an unfair way. The only way to repair this is that this land goes back to who it belongs to,
yeah,
and perhaps not the entire land, perhaps half, but the other half belongs to those new generations that are. But people who would make the community self-sufficient, and that's very important, very very important. I was blown by the way the European pharmaceutical and the US pharmaceutical rejected even considering the Artemisia plant that the president of Madagascar said was being used to treat COVID way back in March. It was like, oh no, a tea from a plant? No, we're not going to consider because that doesn't make money. And my thing was that, oh my God, I would like to know more about this Artemisia. I would like to know, to see more research done on what are the component of this plant that was helping people way back then in March. So it's Africa needs to also understand that it needs to reclaim its own path.
yeah. But do you think that part of it is how we have not built our own structures, how we have not built our institutions to our own glory, not to other people's glory, or try to replicate what's going on here, like the democracy that's here? Is it best suited for the democracy that we need in Africa?
And
Is that not the problem that we keep replicating?
and that's
How
the
can we
thing.
get out of it?
Any photocopy is going to be a poor copy of the original. And so, no matter how wonderful the copy machine is, any system would have to reconnect with the process that was going on. And again, it doesn't mean, again, to make a copy of something from the past because something that was going on 500 years ago may not be suitable for the present, but learn from that wisdom in order to build the present. And therefore, colonialism tried to erase everything that was in place. I mean, and we tend to think of colonialism as end of the 19th century. I'm the person who actually linked that with the pillage of people out of Africa since the
Yes.
early 1500. And so my thing is to try to retrace that history. How were people thinking then? And how that process of thought was imagining what? And Africa themselves imagining where Africa and Africans wants to be. Do Africans want to respect their mothers, their women, their children? Do Africans want to stop bleaching? Do Africans want to embrace blackness, beautiful? Do we want to I mean, which is the way to arrive to a point of pride without arrogance, of pride with generosity and love? How can we get to self-love that actually help each other, one love each other? The
Yes.
I mean, even African borders, for God's sake, those borders have nothing to do with Africa. Those were the Europeans who made them. Africa should
But we
act.
are killing ourselves and killing each other for borders
I
that have nothing
know,
to do
I
with us.
know. I mean, the African Congress, the Union Congress should sit down and say, let us think these boundaries suit us and make sense for us today. Should we think about different ways of organizing ourselves? Does it have to be the nation state? And so it has to also be very daring, very, very daring. It's not going to be welcome, but it should be the path. I mean, for me, the borders, when I know that those borders were defined in Berlin by German, Italian, French, Belgian, British, no,
The Berlin Conference.
yeah, the Berlin Conference. It is time that Africans say, you know what, let us stick together and see if it makes sense to have these borders. Let's forget
Yeah.
about where is the oil and where is no oil. We know oil,
Yeah.
Guinea, Nigeria, Cameroon, Angola. I mean, just those little places. But is that in Gabon? Is it that only those countries should benefit from the oil when the whole continent has been pillaged? I mean, there needs to be a more centric consensus way to think of it. And I don't mean everybody to love each other, kumbaya, but just to think about conveniently for the good of people. I mean, yeah,
It,
because
it, it is so hard to even imagine right now that people we've become the identity that that was given to us. We become Zimbabweans before we become Africans. We've become South Africans before we become Africans. Now, my next question, we're going to take a quick break again, but my next question is going to be based on what the academia can do to reshape our minds and help us. So now we're going to take a quick break and then come back to that. Welcome back to the last part of our show. I usually like to keep these shows to an hour, and right now we're logging on to 54 minutes, and it seems like we haven't even talked. We haven't even started, and I feel like, hey, can you come back? There's so much to talk about, and,
yeah,
and I feel we haven't even started. But let
well,
me get back to the question.
cover.
Yeah,
You
let me get back to
Yes, with
let me get
academia,
back to that question
yeah,
that I started. What I really want to know, because I think as much as we can talk about, the rest has to be our responsibility to redress it. And I also think that it starts when we are being educated, or the young age, when we are still being given information. All right, I don't want to use the word educated, but we're still being given correct information. Now, what do you think should happen in the academia for it to truly engage with the history of the people of African descent, and then to really reshape the next generation.
We have to be careful with academia, first of all,
Yes.
because academia, in the sense the way it is has been constructed, is excessively exclusive, elitist, elusive, and
Thank
pretentious
you.
and arrogant.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I am in academia. And so for me, academia cannot function disconnected from the people and activism, and the base activism, the grassroots activism,
Yes.
and the mom, the women who prepare the food, and those who build the biras, and those who play it,
From
and
the
the
culture, from the people.
yeah, and you made, and for me, I distinguish formal education, which is the combination of diplomas one has the opportunity to achieve, from wisdom. I've met people who have not completed elementary school who taught me a lot,
Yes.
a lot. I actually learned a lot. I am who I am by a combination of, yeah, the books and stuff, but I've learned a lot from people who perhaps could not even sign their names. That doesn't mean that they were not imagining. I'm going back to the women that I study. They didn't know how to write. It was forbidden for them to learn how to read and write, and
Yes.
and yet they were conceiving what we now take for granted and thinking came from Europe now. And so academia has to take a responsibility to be more humble, to be more respectful, to, yes, we put things together in paper because we acquire some tools and some skills.
Yes. Yes.
But we are not the tools and skills. We are lent because our life is finite. Some things for us to put in the service of others.
Yes.
So academia in the United States tend to produce a lot of work with a lot of complicated language that only academics read. And many people feel that this is it. I will be dumb and stupid if I think that what I'm doing is only for academia. I have to fulfill some academic requirement, but I write in small activist newsletters when I can. I contribute with activism because I was an activist before I went to academia. And not only that, for the first time, yes, I have a doctorate. Yes, I'm a professor, but that doesn't make me who I am. It's
Yes.
actually the ability to connect and not to fall in love with the laurels of academia. The day a person falls in love with the laurel of academia, a person is gone. It's lost because
Yeah.
then becomes too, because
It's all in their head now.
yeah, and it's useless because that person will then most likely end up abusing others. So if I'm interviewing someone, I have to be thankful in many different ways to that person, and I have to make sure that whatever I learn from that person goes back to the community and the person, and we can interact and grow. And so it's, for me, very, very important that academia moves away, and especially academia in Africa, academia in Latin America, academia in the Caribbean, academia in many different places, get out of that because that was masculine, that was white, and it was wealthy. And that is not helping.
Yeah.
So it has to be a process in which academia is conversing with teachers, social workers, psychologists, engineers, and so forth. It can be something in which only the few selected are entitled. No, I mean, there are people who will not want to, and it's fine. Everybody's in different stages in their journey. But yeah, so that's my thing on academia. I mean, it has a lot of resources and so forth, but
Yes.
many people tend to think that I made it, and the
Yes. Yes.
others. And I,
Thank you so much, Evelyn. I still have so many questions, but we hit an hour, and I want to respect everybody else who has been watching, and I want to respect your time and everybody else behind the scenes, and say thank you so much for joining us.
thank you.
I know that we will get you back. It may not be next week, but we will strive to have you again back so that we can continue the conversation, because we haven't even started talking about Pan-Africanism, for instance. We haven't even speaking about what is happening here in America with Black lives and what just happened and what is happening in Nigeria and everywhere else.
Yes.
What has this got to do with us as a people, or what happened to us?
Yes,
Thank
indeed.
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you again next week. My name is Savannah Manamombe, and my guest, Evelyn Laurent Parel. It was so hard to pronounce that name, but thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Nematombo, Nondo, Mr. Playboy, Stunner, Batai Hanna, Batai Hanna, Batai Hanna, Batai Hanna. Mwenda mberi, museamwa, otiziva, moyo ndishu, matemahiva, mwendisoko, mokuye mukono, roshumba. Kushura baba aiwa uko makata Pasha wedu apasa Sika usati warasa Rita wakachonjoma Pamsora ibana mama Gashirambe wazama Sika kunyora sama Gatsimbise ukama Musapute sasana Une wako mkazana Mungwe chete pasana Piti kanana Mwenda mberi pachana Naziva tasangana Seha matawanana Sakapira kare kushitaura Ngati chengete itika zedu zechivan Waka uya waka zishora Wona nasa tisisirivan Uya nehanda nakakuvi chidzoka naso tutisevana Mwenda mberi, museamwa, otiziva, moyo ndishu, matemahiva, mwendisoko, mokuye mukono, sinyoro shumba. Tatano pinda Cape Town, monotsika hedu jecha, tukavasiya vachivenga, vakagara pajecha. Havandiziva, tata mbonotiva, igara waziva, shaka inyure muziva. Rukupiga moyo ndisho, koshiri kubva muhana, tarisai haso rangu mundipewo mukana. Vanogara vari out, vana mashira pashe, ndimunona nachera itaiti vafadze. Chikona ng'ombe, nana humba, vataya namasizira, vanotiziswa mumba. Dodangwa namadhuve, vanoziva shenzi vese hanzi. Handei kumba, tisachapesa mari yese gogogoe.